that I knew of that even used the language spirituality. It was either religion or theology. Typically, if you were in a Protestant context, you talked about religion, and if you go to a Catholic school, it's often talked about as the theology department. So I would use those synonymously. I grew up a Quaker and still am a Quaker, although I've broadened my experience to include Catholicism. I actually am a Benedictine oblate, which means I hang on as a layperson in a Benedictine monastery. And I've done quite a lot of work in what I would call the interfaith movement, the movement between Christianity and other major world religions, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. And I have a pretty fair amount of global travel behind me, so I've had some experience being in India where the culture is more primarily Hindu or so forth. So that tends to be my background. The non-Catholic world began to discover spirituality, as it was called, probably in the early 1980s. And as one who had done a PhD in Christian history, I realized that I actually had some more interest in spirituality than I might have had in history. And so in some ways I found a way to morph what I'd done as a doctoral student into the kinds of classes I tend to teach today. So I spend probably every time I meet with a class time talking about faith and spirituality. So I thought I'd begin by trying to differentiate what I would mean by religion and what I would mean by spirituality. Certainly spirituality can be a loose term. So when somebody says, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, I can't know for sure what they would mean, but I'll give you a rough approximation. When I think about religion, or if you want theology, I think of an institution, I think of the cleric, a pastor or a priest, I think about ritual, sometimes dogma, and I think that's certainly in the mind of the younger folks who are in college these days. Religion indicates the institutionalization, if you will. In itself, it's not bad, but if they perceive it as out of date or uninteresting, it's dismissed anyway. Spirituality, for me, always starts with experience. So when I think about spirituality and when I talk about spirituality, I'm interested in experience first and in doctrine or theology second. As a matter of fact, you can't talk about experience without using some kind of words and ultimately probably some kind of religious language. But when I talk about spirituality, we don't start there. And as you think about maybe working with young people and they say spiritual, one of the things I might suggest is you ask them what do they mean by that, because it tends to be a loose term. So for me, spiritual means experience. And let me give you a distinction between religion and spirituality. If somebody says, oh, I'm religious, I might say, well, tell me about it, and they would tend to start talking about what they believe. Somebody who's religious will tend to say, I believe in God or I believe in Jesus. So they're really giving you doctrine, even if it's just a personal doctrine. And so I would perhaps ask a question that has to do with spirituality by saying, oh, I understand you believe in God. Now, help me understand how you experience that God. Or how does that God show up in your life? That's to ask a spiritual question as opposed to a religious question the way I'm working with it. And so for me, when I talk about spirituality and when I teach spirituality, it always has an experiential base to it. And then we'll enable people to start talking out of their experience. A corollary would be we could all go to a carnival and we would all be at the same event, but we wouldn't necessarily have the same experience because I would interpret it differently than you would be. So that's what I would mean by experiential. And then the language we would use could be different, could be common, and so that perhaps gives you a sense of where I go with experience. So I teach classes now that usually has spirituality in the title, and it always has a spirituality component. So yes, I do have a specific faith which I practice. It's Quakerism, which for me means it's Christian, and that would be within then the larger umbrella of religion. So how does this impact my life, my work in the classroom, on a campus? I would say the fact that I'm a Quaker, I'm a Christian, I see myself as religious, that impacts my work significantly. And the fact that I'm a Quaker impacts the way I go about it, as I would assume a Catholic would say the same thing, or a Presbyterian, or a Hindu. How does it affect me? Well, my own Quaker perspective says that we're all equal in the sight of God and that titles are not necessary. So one of the things I do is ask everyone in my classroom to call me by my first name. I've had that since I've been alive. I have only had a PhD after about 20 plus years of study. So that I've got a PhD is true, but my name is more important. My own Quaker tradition informs me in the sense that all people are treated equal, women, men, race, even age. So I really am trying to cultivate a classroom, or if I were in a dorm, a community where there's respect, where people treat each other collegially. In fact, I often ask the students, isn't it interesting that our word college and collegial must come from the same root? So you're in college, I'm going to try to learn how to teach you to be colleagues. And the last thing that my own tradition would help me understand and try to undertake in a classroom is respect for diversity. I can say the classroom is far more diverse now than when I was in college, and that's a good thing. And I think a classroom, I think a dorm perhaps even more so, is a wonderful opportunity to help people understand respect, dignity, collegiality, and the way I see it, it really is a benign form of peacemaking in a world that sorely needs peacemakers. I was asked, how do you experience working with students who integrate, have you had experience working with students who integrate their faith into their college journey? I would say, of course. In fact, this is one of the focus that I would have for every class is how do I help a student integrate their faith into their college journey? I take a minute and just say, faith often sounds like a religious word, but in fact, it's not a religious word per se. I know the classical languages, and in Latin, the word for faith is fiduciary. If you want a good synonym for the word faith, it's trust. So if I said I had faith in God, what that means is I trust God. And so the word fiduciary is used in the business world all the time. Boards of trustees have fiduciary responsibilities. If you're an employee of a college, you have a fiduciary responsibility, which is nothing more than you have a responsibility to be faithful, to be trustworthy. And again, that's the kind of community that we want to build on any size campus, be it Ohio State or a big one like that or a smaller college like my own. So that work of integration of faith in one's college journey, it seems to me, is a really important one. And one of the things I learned as a faculty person a long time ago was that there is a lot of education that goes on a college campus and it doesn't happen in the classroom. It happens in dorms, it happens in student unions, on the athletic field, in the conservatory. So I like to think that everybody on campus is a teacher and everybody is a student. Some of the most effective teachers we have on our campus, I think, work in the cafeteria. Coaches are primary teachers for athletes, and so it goes. So what I like to do is frequently incorporate other academic disciplines into the discussion about spirituality. So you think about it. If you're talking about evolution, you're necessarily going to pull in the disciplines from the sciences. If you're a human being, the discipline of psychology always plays a role. So I like to have students who are majoring in something else, psychology, biology, chemistry, try to figure out how do they incorporate and then integrate their majors into a religion course or even into a religious discussion. One of the questions I would have is, has my experience been different with students who have faith traditions other than my own. And again, I would say, of course, in fact, I spend virtually all my time with people who have a different faith tradition. Within the Christian family, my own faith tradition is minuscule. I like to tell people in the Cleveland area where I'm speaking from, in the Cleveland diocese, the Catholic diocese, there are 4 times more Roman Catholics than there are Quakers in the entire country. So my own faith tradition is really tiny. So I spend a lot of time working with people from a variety of Christian traditions, and then there's no campus that doesn't have the religious diversity that comes from other major religious traditions. The Jewish tradition, Buddhism, Hindu, Muslim, and perhaps some others like the Sikhs. So yeah, I've had a lot of experience, and again, I would go back to what I say earlier. I don't know of any major religious tradition that doesn't ask for us to have respect for the other, to treat the other with justice, some of those classical virtues. So I would continue to find ways to have students interact so that they get experience and then perhaps develop a habit to treat each other that way. That's the kind of society I'm sure all of us want to live in, and college is a wonderful time to help students learn to do things perhaps in new ways or better ways, and I think religion or spirituality can be effective in helping us do that. All the major religious traditions, all the people who talk about spirituality are wanting that. So somebody asked me to share a story or an experience of what I've learned over the years. And honestly, one of the things that I learned that became a crucial insight into my teaching is if you walk into a classroom, everybody sitting there has a story. And if it's a chemistry class or perhaps a political science class, maybe even an English class, there's probably not too much likelihood that you'll get to know the student or even the faculty's story. But we all have stories. Some people's mother may have just heard that she's got cancer. Somebody may be sick. Somebody's got an illness that nobody knows about. Somebody's got high blood pressure that doesn't show. So think about it. Everybody has a story. And even if I know you over X number of weeks, your story will get additions to it. Last week you may have been happy. This week you got dumped by your best friend. Your story's different than it was. So one of the things I try to take into account is that everybody has a story, and whatever we're talking about, whatever I'm asking them to do or they're asking me to do, somehow implicates, if not includes, the story that they're living out. The corollary of that is, I wonder if what I'm doing in a classroom or on the baseball field or in the dorm, I wonder if what I'm asking them to do isn't somehow going to affect their story. So I really see part of the calling in my vocation as a faculty person is to help young people shape their story so that they will be better than they thought they could be. They will be more effective in a positive direction within society, that they will become people who are better able committee members, teachers, lawyers, whatever they're going to be, that this is a really significant building block in that. And spirituality for me plays a really crucial part in that because for me, remember, it's experiential. I'm starting with them. Their experience is, in some sense, an accumulation of all that they were until they walked into the classroom, 18 years, 19 years. Their story includes some of their parents' story, their good friend's story, their peer's story. So it's really pretty significant. Another question, have I ever helped someone practice a different faith or find a new faith? I'd say, of course, pretty routinely, a lot of the time. For example, if I'm teaching a class that has them reading a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Christian monk, a Quaker, Why wouldn't I ask them to join me in visiting a place that's a Muslim synagogue? Why wouldn't we go to a Jewish synagogue? Why not visit a Catholic Benedictine monastery? Again, I can help them think about their lives. I can enrich their experience by giving them an experiential situation. So how many times we've been asked to read about something? I could read about prayer. I could read about Buddhist meditation. But why not ask somebody, well, let's practice meditation. I don't know how. I'll say, well, let's find out, or I'll show you how. Providing that experiential base. And as all of you work with young people, you will be working in a different context than I am, but you can approach it similarly. What can you ask that would provide a different kind of experience? And once you've provided the experience, don't just go halfway, which is what I would call the experience. Think about going the rest of the way and adding a reflective piece. People have experiences all the time. You go through a day and you have multiple experiences. But the chance of learning from your experience typically comes when somebody says, what was it like? Tell me what your experience was. You ask somebody to start reflecting on what just happened to you. In some ways, that's what an experience is. What just happened to you? So you put it in spirituality terms. It's not unusual, for instance, in a class where we may stumble into a discussion about baptism. Well, we could talk about baptism, what it was like in the New Testament. We could talk about what it was like in the 4th century, whether they baptized infants or adults. It's all very interesting. I know enough to have that conversation. But it's different to turn the tables a bit and say, has anybody ever here been baptized? And of course, quite a number in the room would be. And then you would say, well, tell me about it. If we have a classroom that's rich in diversity, that respects each other, what you'll find out is, in many instances in my classroom, there are always some Catholics, and typically they got baptized when they were babies, so they have no memory of it. And there are other non-Catholics there, a good Baptist who may have gotten baptized when she or he was 10. And so they can talk about what baptism was like. And then you can say to the Catholic, well, if you have no memory of baptism, what's your earliest memories? And of course, they will always move on to confirmation and the process they went through that. So that kind of sharing of experience in a classroom is really effective in building a classroom community because they're learning from each other. And that's powerful learning. And you don't have to be in a classroom. You could be in a dorm room. You could be in a hallway and have the same kind of discussion. Well, reflect on your baptism. If you don't remember it, what were you told about it? What are the stories? If you do remember your baptism, and of course you can take out baptism and shove in almost anything else around spirituality. So yeah, I routinely try to get people out of the classroom into a synagogue or a monastery or a church to engage other people. When I think about the many times I've taken a group of students to a monastery, even if they're Catholic, they've probably never been to a monastery. So there's a certain amount of anxiety. They're glad I'm going with them. There's a certain amount of trepidation. They're wondering, what do you do? And so that in itself begins to acquaint students with learning to experiment when many don't have that kind of comfort level. It's learning to be present in a context that's different than you. And it's easy then to use that spiritual, experiential field trip, if you will, and say, okay, someday you may be a boss, someday you may be a leader, in which on the team will be a Muslim, a Hindu, an atheist, it's not unlike the classroom we've just been. How do you listen? How do you learn to ask questions? How do you respect what they're telling you? So think about the experiences that already go on in what you do, and how can you enrich it by adding the reflective piece? And one of the things that I try routinely in my classroom and wherever else I am on campus is to help students learn two pretty basic skills. And if they learn these, they'll actually be ahead of the game in the world. And it's amazing to me how many don't think it's that important. The two basic skills, learning to listen and learning to ask questions, which is one way of beginning to invite someone else to tell their story. And most people like to talk about themselves, so it really isn't that hard. Oh, you believe in God? How do you understand God? Or Jesus is really important to you? How's that? We go to an Islamic mosque, we take our shoes off. Well, for a Quaker or a Catholic, that seems strange. Well, that only gives the answer from my perspective. For me, it's strange. If I'm a Muslim, it's perfectly normal. So why did I just take my shoes off? I mean, those are the kinds of things. And then I'm willingly going to listen to somebody who knows what they're talking about do that. Okay, let me pause a minute and see if there are any questions. I have some people in front of me. There may be some out there listening who have any questions yet. A pause here. Doesn't look like any questions. Okay. You're going to make it hard for me. Yes, please. There's going to be a question in my room, and then I'll repeat it.
My question is, so sometimes, particularly in the residential communities, we have students who don't want to sort of engage in some of these conversations that can build a community because they're very comfortable with what they know. And so how do you encourage people to be open to that dialogue in a way that is constructive and they don't necessarily feel too challenged outside of their comfort zone?
Okay. Question is, in a residential context, there may be some people who are reticent to engage in a conversation around spirituality, either because they really don't want to or because they're quite happy within the framework that they think about and they simply don't want to be a part of it. Well, obviously, I have to start by saying I would respect that. One of the things that I might ask that person is, well, would you be willing just to sit with the group as we talk about it, even if you don't want to share? Because at least that way you know what the rest of the folks on the dorm floor or in the dorm are talking about. That part of community, I think, is important, and I really hope that you'd like to be a part of that. I respect you don't really want to talk about it, and nobody's going to make you, so relax on that one. But it'd be nice if you could be a part of the conversation. The other thing I might do is think about visiting them, him or her, one-on-one. Go to the room at some point, say, I'm really interested in where you are, and I understand you don't want to share it in a bigger group, but I'd be happy if you'd share something about your own faith tradition with me. I'd like to understand it more because it's going to help me get to know you better. So if you're willing to share that, I'd be more than delighted to hear. So I'd probably try those two things to begin with. And if they'd say, no, I don't think I really want to, I would respect that and say, well, I hope over the next few weeks we get to know each other well enough that you'd be willing to share some things with me, partly because I would like to get to know you better. And if faith for you is as important as you're probably saying it is, then that's a very significant part of your story. So that's how I would approach that. Maybe this is a good place for me to say also, there are times, probably the hardest place for me when it comes to a discussion about spirituality is the person who's so absolutely sure that he or she knows where they are religiously speaking, in some ways a fundamentalist, And at least for those of us who are Christian, I would differentiate a fundamentalist from an evangelical. A fundamentalist is one who would take the Bible literally, say there's no room for interpretation, it means what it says, and it says what it means, period. That's a fundamentalist, not open to criticism or critique. It's either or. An evangelical is one who is going to view the Christian Bible as a very important authority, but an evangelical is willing to read the Bible critically. That doesn't mean I'm going to read it in a way that puts it down, but critically in the sense of using scholarship, seeing that not everything may be able to be taken literally. So there's a kind of nuancing of it, and obviously the evangelical would be on one end of the spectrum, and you could go to the other end of the spectrum to the liberal, who feels quite at ease with interpreting the Bible any way he or she might want to. So for me personally, and I think for any group talking about spirituality, the most difficult place to be is when there's a fundamentalist, because that is an either-or position. And typically there's not dialogue there. There's either convincement or I'm sorry. So if you want to think about that, that distinction, if you've got a fundamentalist, I think you've got one issue. If you've got an evangelical, that affords some other possibilities. So that's a pretty significant one. As we're talking along, yes, please, follow-up question.
So one of the conflicts that we sometimes run into in residence life is we will put two roommates together who maybe don't know each other ahead of time, and then they get here and realize that perhaps one roommate identifies as part of the LGBT community, and that's not okay with the other roommate. And in our office, we sometimes feel caught between wanting to obviously make both students feel comfortable and respected, but also really sticking to our institutional values that say that we accept and embrace diversity and all these other different pieces. So how would you suggest navigating that?
Okay, the questions are getting harder here in Cleveland. The question had to do with institutionally, we obviously put people together in rooms, and what happens if we put together two people, one of whom is LGBT, or maybe not that, but is open to it, and the other one is not. So they didn't know each other very well in the beginning, and then this issue arises after they're already in the same room living. And that gets complicated because every institution will have a perspective, so that our campus would be inclusive on that particular issue, which makes the one who's having trouble with that issue in the first place even more complicated, because not only do I have a problematic roommate, I've got a problematic institution. So how do we deal with that if we're in the housing office? My suggestion would be to begin the process, is this really a lifestyle issue, or is it a lifestyle issue grounded in religion or spirituality? I would assume those who are troubled with that LGBT as an issue, I would assume they're more than likely grounding the problem into a religious tradition somewhere. I don't know that that's a necessity, but that'd be the first thing. And so I'd probably be asking the person who's troubled by it, because that will be the person raising the issue. It's the one who's okay with it is not probably going to be raising the issue. I would say, so can you tell me a bit about your own spiritual life such that it makes that a problem? Because I want to understand you. I want to be able to appreciate where you're coming from. So again, when I'm dealing with spirituality, I really try to be as invitational as I can. And that comes out of my own tradition of being spiritual. If I'm religious, there may be some rules or there may be a doctrine, and you just say, well, that's how it is, because the church says so or the institution says so. But I really would approach it much more invitationally. I think that welcomes honesty. I think it honors authenticity, and it gives you a better chance to solve whatever problem there is. Clearly, one end result is that you can move the roommates out, or at least one of them. So that's always the final solution, and sometimes that's necessary. In marriage, that's called divorce. Maybe the same thing can be applicable to roommates. But I'd really try to work because in some ways that's a teachable opportunity. It may or may not do what we could hope so. So I would see, is this a religious issue? If so, how? And one of the things I would take my cue from my own Christian tradition, and if you want to ground it in the Apostle Paul, that's where it would be grounded for me. Typically, I would say, when you have a conflict like that, it's really up to the one who's not as troubled to make more allowance. So in this case, if somebody is really concerned about the LBG issue and the roommate is not troubled by it all, I would say the one who's not troubled by it all has probably more understanding to give than the other one. If I'm the one troubled, it's like that's enough. The other one needs to give me more space or grace. And it doesn't mean you just capitulate. But if I'm in a position of strength, I think I'm the one who owes more than 50%, if you put it in that kind of language. And that's a particular mindset, because the temptation is, if I'm the one in the strength, then I can win. That tends to be the American way, and I would say, I don't think that builds community. It's how can I be, if I'm in a position of strength, can I be more gracious or more yielding without capitulating? And that's a judgment call, right? So one of the things that I thought I might do to take just a little further is, I don't know how many students in my classrooms, and I'm sure classrooms all over the states that are involved in the Great Lake Association, the students would announce, I'm spiritual but not religious. And there's been some really good studies, careful studies, and what that typically can mean, and I'm giving you this as a kind of model, it might not fit one particular student, but typically when somebody is saying, I'm spiritual but not religious, what they would typically do is still have a belief in a higher power or an energy source. They might not even want to use the word God. Jesus typically might not be in the picture, except as a good guy. But if somebody says, I'm spiritual but not religious, I think odds are they're still probably expressing a belief in a higher power or an energy source or something like that. And again, this is the kind of thing, if you listen and if you ask questions, it's nice to be able to pursue that. Well, tell me a little more about how do you experience that higher power? And it's one thing to say you believe in it. You could believe in unicorns too, but it's hard to experience a unicorn. Does that make sense? So I would say, yeah. Well, tell me, how do you ever know or how do you ever experience that higher power? How are you aware of this energy source that you're believing? And then I'm just ready to listen because I'm fascinated by how they will begin to characterize their experience. What kind of language will they use? Will they say, you know, when I have that sense of a higher power, I just feel better? I think, well, that's interesting. How do you feel better? So you can see how I try to go about it and continually trying to invite more and ask them, and it won't be unusual because almost never does anybody treat us like this. Pretty soon they're probably going to run up against a wall and say, I don't know, I never thought about this before. And so when I'm in a classroom doing this kind of stuff, I don't know how many times people walk away saying, I never thought about this before. I'm not sure what I think. I'd say, wonderful, this is college. This is a university. So typically they will believe in a higher power or an energy source, but what they typically don't believe in is some controlling deity. Maybe the kind of God they heard about in the church or the kind of God they think they would hear about in the church if they ever went. So they're sort of against that kind of God who's controlling things, but they do believe in a higher power and an energy source. Second thing, and interestingly enough, they may say, no, I don't really believe in heaven and hell, but I do believe in some kind of life after death. A lot of the people in college now today seem to be fascinated by reincarnation, although they probably haven't thought much about it. They probably have never read one Buddhist or Hindu who ever thought about reincarnation. So a lot of times I think young people might be for something, but they've never really thought much about it. So again, I would treat those as teachable moments and say, if you're in a group, does anybody else think about reincarnation? Do 8 of the 10 in this room think about it and I'm just unaware of it? That's the kind of thing I'm looking for, because every year I get older and the age group of college students tends to be the same. So I shouldn't presuppose I know anything. So I say, really, how many here believe in that? Tell me more. All those kinds of invitational questions to see how your work is as central to the educational enterprise as what I might be doing as a faculty person in a classroom. Third thing that I can almost guarantee they mean when they say, I'm spiritual but not religious, is they tend to be anti-institutional, which means anti-church or anti-synagogue or wherever they grew up or thought they might have had to go if their parents had taken them. So anti-institutional. You have a lot of people in college and universities who may have gone to church, some growing up, but when they hit campus, they'll never go again. Some of them feel slightly guilty. Some of them haven't looked back since and don't intend to go. So there's this anti-institutional. There's a sense of individualization. When they say, I'm spiritual but not religious, they mean I am whatever I decide to be. I'm not what the church or the synagogue, I'm not what they tell me I should be, whether that's theology or ethically. When they're saying I'm spiritual but not religious, in some ways that's a declaration of independence. I will be who I want to be. It also means individualized, it means anti-institutional, it tends to mean experimental. And the last thing I would say is it often means I'm going to be eclectic, which means I'm going to choose from here and choose from here. You know, I believe in God, but I really believe in what the Buddhists are doing in terms of meditation. I really like this. I like that. So it tends to be experimental and what I call eclectic. Pick and choose. The last thing I might identify when I think somebody says I'm spiritual but not religious, sometimes that has some aspect of being therapeutic. That this is the way I'm going in order to live life wholly. W-H-O-L-Y, not H-O-L-Y. That this is going to be the way I unify or integrate my life. Spirituality is going to be a piece of it. But it's the kind of spirituality that I craft that makes sense to me, that there's not some church I have to go to with a bunch of rituals I've got to do with a lifestyle that I don't believe in. So that's a caricature, if you will, of what it means when the person says I'm spiritual but not religious. But I think it's a fairly accurate one. The time's fleeting. Any questions from my group in front of me as we roll along? Oh, we've got a question from the audience out there. Here's the question from somebody I can't see. Thank you. What, if any, implications does the concept of separation of church and state play in the conversation of faith and spirituality, particularly at public institutions? Good question. I think sometimes the I'm spiritual but not religious perspective also tends to be a declaration of independence, politically speaking, from parents, from church tradition, whatever is a part of your experience behind you. Clearly, the separation of church and state is a significant issue in our culture for good reason. My sense, though, is most state institutions that I'm aware of, public institutions, you know, the Purdue's, the University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, they all have classes that teach religion or spirituality. They certainly have philosophy classes that teach about God. If you're going to read Augustine, St. Augustine, you're going to read about God, or Thomas Aquinas or Luther. So it's not like if there's a church and state separation that nobody can ever talk about God. There's a Newman Center on the campus of almost every place, the Catholic place. So I would look for where can we have these conversations such that nobody's party line is being pushed, whether in a classroom or in a dorm. Can we have a conversation so that you tell me your story, and I understand your story that includes you're a secular Jew. Huh, what's that? I don't know any. Tell me, help me understand what that means. And really invite that person not only to tell you about maybe what being a secular Jew means, but what it means to that particular person. Because that's what you're really wanting to do, is to engage a person or to engage a group. So if I were teaching at a public institution, I would still feel relatively free to have these conversations in almost the same vein that I've been talking about today. I think the dorm room is a relatively safe place for there. Again, what I would suggest is nobody's pushing a party line. That's how I would deal with it. Any questions here among the folks? Another one? Carrie, you have one? Oh, here comes another one. Hang on out there in the audience. Okay. I've read that young people, college students, are fleeing organized religions, but interest in spirituality has increased with the same age group. Have you seen this? Indeed, I have. I might reference a Pew, P-E-W, which is one of the big groups in the country that does all sorts of interesting things. In 2015, a little over a year ago, they did a huge study nationwide, and the report was entitled America's Changing Landscape. And the Pew report has all these statistics, and basically one thing they suggest is the number of people in this country who are, quote, religious is continuing to go down. No surprise. But still, America is one of the most religious countries in the world. Again, no surprise. But in that Pew study of a little over a year ago, they found that 1 in 5 adults consider themselves to be non-religious. 1 in 5. And that number is increasing. Every time they do this study, that number goes up. So that perhaps is the trend line of the present. And of that group, 18 to as old as you can imagine, the younger you go into the adult population, the more people would say, I'm not religious. So younger people, college-age students, the number would be higher than 1 out of 5. So what that means is we're dealing with a population where a number of them, a significant number, are saying, I'm not religious. But they might say, I'm spiritual. So that's why this conversation is so helpful. If we see religion and spirituality as synonyms, then we're going to miss a big boat. A lot of people are much more clear about, I'm not religious, and they might mean, and I'm not spiritual either, or I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. So 1 in 5. I think what's at stake when a lot of people say, I'm not religious, is they're really talking about an issue of trust. Trust in the church or the synagogue or the temple as an institution. Trust in the leadership of that, whether it's a priest, an imam, a board of elders. So in that sense, it's a faith issue. And I think we see comparable issues of trust even in our political world as we look at it today. At least that's how I would read it. So yeah, I see that as an ongoing issue, and what I would do on a college campus is to figure out venues by which we can have this discussion. I'll begin to round off our time as it's coming to a close. One of the things I do when I think about religion or spirituality is I see those two issues, and I'm going to use them together now, religion and spirituality. I see them as primarily dealing with how people make sense out of life. Religion and or spirituality is one way human beings work on the meaning and purpose question. And I don't know that the typical college-age student is working directly on that. They tend to be more interested in their majors, their careers, all that, which is age appropriate. But I also find students wind up having a great deal of interest in how am I going to make sense out of life? What am I going to do that's meaningful? And again, one can read about all the issues that are around the focus of careers, and it's quite clear that this group of college-age folks want to work in a place that's meaningful. And many of them will actually take less money to be in a place where they're happy, or they like their peer workers, or there's meaning and purpose in what I do. That's important, and I think it will become increasingly important. And I think the spirituality discussion is one way to get ahead of that. So meaning and purpose. And if I'm talking with a group of students, I can begin to say, well, what we're doing here is about you. It's about your life and how your life is going to have some sense of meaning or purpose. And it's hard for somebody to say, my goodness, that really is boring. I don't want to do that. So that's why I don't lecture. That's why I begin to get invitational to say, it really is about you. It's about your life and how you want to make some meaning and purpose. And if you don't think it's important now, 2 or 3 years from now, if you're a senior, you might be married and you might have a little baby. And I bet you start thinking about it then. What are you going to teach the little guy or gal? Because you're going to be the primary teacher for at least 2 or 3 years, 4 years. How do you want to set them up foundationally in life? Do you want to say, well, little guy, life has no meaning. There's zero purpose. It sucks. Welcome. You got 80 or 90 years of this. And that's what I tell students. You don't have to start now, but what if you live and work for another 50 years? You want that to be rich, meaningful? You want to think about life? Surely it's more than your work. Surely it's more than just, a happy time on the weekend. So that's where I think the spirituality discussion, if you want to set religion aside, that's where spirituality can still be a really good lure and pull into thinking about life, thinking about how to make a good life and a life that's good with good people. Because the alternatives don't sound like much fun to me. A bad life, a pointless life with bad people or stupid people. Oh yeah, sign me on. 40 years, please. So that to me is the lure, that's the promise of these kinds of discussions, is meaning and purpose. Well, I know we're getting close to the end. Any more questions? Here's one more. This one we'll go out on. How do you teach active listening for our students? Specifically in terms of listening around differences regarding spirituality and religion. I've got a couple practices that I do. One of the things that I'll tell students is when I ask a question, it's a real question. And when I ask a question, I'll just wait. And I can wait longer than you will be comfortable. And they will soon learn. So I value a question, and the students will come to value that too. No, I really am interested. Tell me. I can encourage. The other thing is I'll tell people, listening is really important. And I'll know perhaps in the beginning many of them won't listen. So if my friend Sarah says something really important in class, I will say, I think Sarah just said something important. Joe, what did Sarah just say? has no clue what you just said. She wasn't talking to him. He didn't pay any attention. I said, well, you can't pay attention if you're listening is paying attention. So I'll say, Sarah, please repeat that, because Joe and I are listening now. And you begin to set up a culture where you just taught 25 others. It wasn't just Joe that got the lesson. Others say, oh yeah. They don't even know why I think Sarah's comment was important, because they really weren't tuned in. So listening is a skill. Asking a question is a skill. Anybody can learn it. It's got nothing to do with major or minor. And besides, that's a good thing to do if you have a wife or a husband, kids, a good friend. Listening and asking questions is really a good thing to do. Well, I think we've run out of questions. I may have run out of good things to say by now, and I hope in some ways this has been helpful. Carrie, how are we doing? Is she listening in? I'm about ready to sign off. No?
Hello, can you hear me?
I
lost
can.
the mute button for a moment. Well, thank you, Alan, very much for presenting for us today. Tyler in the audience said this was fantastic. Thank you. So I think we can all echo sentiments. Thank you very much. Just a reminder to everyone that this webinar was recorded and it will be available on the Glokuho website afterwards. Thank you for your time and attention today.